Who is going to carry out the transformations that would make permanent revolution a reality in countries like Egypt and Tunisia?
Well, I was just saying, talking about the importance of the Marxism conference every year, every July. It's a great event. Speakers, people who come like yourselves who contribute to the discussion. And I can't imagine a more important year than this year to be having such a meeting, because not only have we just had the June 30th strike, but if you look around the world, if you look at Greece, if you look at Syria, if you look at Egypt, if you look at Libya, you'll find the same urgings of people to get some control of their own lives is to be found everywhere. And although the state of development in many of these countries is quite different from our own, in each case, people say, why cannot I have some say in how I'm governed? And that is the basis on which all progress has been made. And if I look back on history, that was how the poll tax was beaten in 1381. People said, why should we who have no money pay the same tax as the rich who can afford it? And the poll tax was dropped. And that was an important move. Or when the English Revolution, they executed the king and we had a parliamentary government, then that was because people said, we don't want to be governed by the king, we want to elect our own parliament. And then, of course, trade unions came along, and we all know about the Tolpota martyrs who were sent to Australia as punishment for joining a trade union. Then we know about the campaign for the vote for men, and then the levellers, and then the suffragettes. And all over our history, we have witnessed at various stages demands for greater role for people to decide their own future. And it's very significant that one of the products of all these changes that I mentioned have been that people have had some greater control. I think the most revolutionary idea in the world is democracy, because before we had democracy in Britain, everything was decided by market forces. If you could have the money, you could afford a house, you could afford education, you could afford health care. You didn't, you couldn't. Then when democracy came along, people could use the vote to vote for public health and public education for themselves and their families. And those public services are the things the government most bitterly attacked. And that's why the resistance on the pensions and everything else is so strong and so important that we understand where it's going. Now, the question is, where is it going? And that depends critically upon us, because there are moments quite regularly when people suddenly feel excited and do something about it, and then there are very subtle forces brought into being which discourage people from making the effort. Oh, it won't work, they're all the same, just crooked, nothing will happen, don't bother, it's way out. And that is the moment where the pressure which could be applied is diverted, and that's why the media plays such an important part, because they determine how the public see what it is that is proposed. And I think that the internet and Socialist Worker and all our own press are now providing people with an alternative interpretation of what's happening. And that is the most optimistic thing you can think of, because if people are not put off by the Sun and the Mail and the news of the world, then we should have more moments of progress. But here we come up against a problem that you'll be very well aware about, and that is the way the political parties react to this situation. The Labour Party was set up, as you know, because once working people had to vote, they said, well, now we've struggled for the vote, we've got the vote, now we want to be represented in Parliament, and that, under the Labour Representation Committee and the Labour Party, came into being. But, and here's the thing, and I think as a movement we have to think about very carefully. When the Labour Party was set up, it became a part of the establishment itself. And in this, I sometimes think of the two political leaderships as alternative management teams, each with a better idea of how to run the status quo. Well, the problem is the status quo. And if you're going to change things, you have to start by discussing what we want to see happen. And we have got to break the power of capital over our society if we are to make any progress. And that power of capital is very, very powerful. It's expressed in a million ways, expressed through the market system, expressed through multinational corporations, expressed through the IMF and the European Central Bank, all of which are run by appointed people and not by elected people. And I think if the Labour Party is going to make any progress, and the Socialists in Britain are going to make any progress, we have to think of ourselves more and more as a campaigning organisation, as I know the SWP does, and less as just hovering about hoping we'll get our chance to govern the status quo. So that's the lesson that I've drawn from all this, but I do feel great hope now, because I never remember a time in my life when there was such a mass pressure for change all over the world. And they're all stemming from the same thing. People don't feel they're properly represented. And if that mood really becomes very, very strong, then we are in for a second French Revolution or English Revolution, and things after that will never be the same again. But to do it, we need the effort of those who are here, who have experience of what's wrong, some experience of how to run campaigns to get it right, and have the confidence to believe that what we want to do can be done. And I think that confidence in ourselves is the key, really, to the whole thing, because all history is made by people doing things. If you don't do something, nothing happens at all. And so the confidence that we have as a socialist movement that we can make these changes that are necessary is going to be the thing that really makes a difference. That's all I really wanted to say, but thank you for asking me. And I think we've got another speaker, and then there are any questions. Right, okay, well, I'll take my mug of tea.
Don't want to come up to the front, just write it on the speaker slip, but I do encourage you to come up to the front to ask a question, that's okay. The next speaker that we have is Karen Reissman, who is a campaigning nurse in Manchester and was recently elected NEC member of Unison.
Meetings about the welfare state, Matt. People completely aren't old enough to remember the welfare state was created after the Second World War, and it was for the first time provided housing. They built 200,000 council houses every year during that first government. They created free education. There was a benefit system for the first time, so unemployment no longer held the fear that it had before the war. There was a pension scheme, so you didn't have to live your old age in poverty, and probably the best known was the NHS, where people no longer need to live in fear of being ill. These formed an absolute massive change to people's lives. And I want to just go through a little bit of why they were created, and then go through why they're being attacked now, and then look at what we can do to defend them. And I think they were created for two primary reasons. One was that workers fought for them. They were not prepared to go back to the 30s, which were absolutely horrendous, where people lived in abject poverty at a time of economic crisis. But also, in the course of the war, there had been big strikes that had built up as the war had gone on. There was 142,000 1,000 strikes in 1943 and 1944. And I think that reflected the fact that workers said they were not prepared to go back to living in poverty and living in fear in the way that they had before. Quentin Hogg, who, as you can imagine from his name, was a Tory, said if we don't give them social reform, they will give us social revolution. And I think that's a big reason why the welfare state was created after the Second World War. But the second reason why it was created was because it actually suited capitalism at the time. Unlike the 30s, the war and after the war, there was the longest boom of capitalism there had ever been. Unlike the 30s, where people were queuing up outside factories for jobs and were told, we'll have you and we'll have you, there were vacancies outside every factory. And what capitalism needed, it needed workers who were fit, and before the war, only 30% of workers were fit to work, another third were semi-fit to work, and a third really weren't fit at all. They needed people who were educated. They needed people who were rested. So they needed a welfare state in order to provide healthy workers who could actually go out and create more profits for them. So it suited them. And it wasn't just in Britain with a Labour government that we ended up with a welfare state, but right across the world you saw the development of sort of a whole set of institutions that would allow workers to come to work fit and ready to be exploited. And that was an important reason why the welfare state, why they went along with it. It was a boom and they could afford to give us some of the crumbs for ourselves, but also they wanted us to be fit and healthy to work for them. And I think it is absolutely true that those institutions that were set up, particularly the House Service, and it's where I come from and I probably know it best, when it was set up, there were problems around private GPs, there were still private beds, there were still a number of things that were not anything near socialism. But in the main, the health service was set up so that regardless of who you were, regardless of how much money you had in your pocket or where you came from, if you were ill, you got treated. It was a system based on need. It didn't have health as a commodity. I was at a meeting last week, and there was a woman there who was in her 70s, and she said she remembers her brother being ill, very, very seriously ill, and they had the doctor in every day for 12 weeks. The bill for that in 1942 was 40 guineas, which for those of you who are too young is £40 plus 45p. And in those days was an enormous amount of money, which she said their parents ended up paying long after the NHS was created because they could only afford to pay it in instalments. That's the sort of problem that the pre-NHS created, that the NHS was aimed to solve. And I think one of the things that the whole question of the health service, and the reason why it is so iconic for people in Britain, is because it does raise the whole question of what sort of world do we live in, what sort of priorities we have, and what is possible. And I think the fact that, you know, after the 30s, after the horrendous Second World War, we were in a much worse state than we are today. We could afford to offer healthcare to anybody who wanted. And today, you know, 63 years later, they're somehow telling us that's not possible. And that's just nonsense. And I think the whole question of the NHS does, and the welfare state, does raise that question of what on earth is capitalism up to, why does it not deliver for people, and is there an alternative? And I think the health service has raised that. And there were huge gains made, life expectancy, infant mortality, a whole number of measures by which you can see the changes that were made as a result of that. And to be honest, you only have to look at the United States to look at what the alternative to that is, where essentially you have the free market let rip. America, they spend twice as much as any other country in the world on health. The bill this year is over £3 trillion, which is 4 times what they spend on defence. It is a huge amount of money. And you would expect, if they spent that money, that the health of the people in the United States would be good. In fact, that is not true. There are 23 countries in the world who spend a fraction of what America spends, who has better health than Americans. 42 million people, and these are not unemployed people because they are entitled to basic Medicare if you're unemployed. 43 million working people have no health care whatsoever in that system. And so for all the money that they spend, because it's spent through a market, huge amounts of it are wasted and squandered on things that don't make people healthy at all. When I first started in the health service, we spent 4% of our income on administration. Sadly, that's now gone up to 17%. But in America, the figure is between 20 and 30, depending on whose figures you take. Huge amounts of money squandered on billing and selling each other, never mind the huge profits that the health companies take out of it. And I think that was a huge step forward for workers when you saw the welfare state developed in that time. And as long as the boom of capitalism continued right through to the mid-70s, the welfare state continued at all. It was when that boom ended in the mid-70s and they had the first economic crisis after the Second World War that you began to see the first attacks on the welfare state. The very first time that we were expected in the health service to take budget cuts was in 1977 under a Callaghan government. Thatcher then, when she was elected and the economic crisis got worse, went for even more cuts and went for a start of privatisation. Sadly, when Blair was elected, he went absolutely running down that road of privatisation. And although they did put lots of extra money into the health service, huge amounts of that money have been wasted because it was put in under private market system rather than under a cooperative system that we used to have in the health service. So, for example, £42 billion has been wasted building new hospitals under the PFI scheme, which would have cost us £42 billion less had we done it under the health service. So Labour have wasted it, and I know Dave Prentice at our conference last week talked about how Labour had created the bridge over which the Tories have walked to smash the NHS today, and that is absolutely true. That what the Tories intend to do is actually finish the job that Labour have begun, and the bill that's going through Parliament and the scale of the cuts, the £20 billion cuts, the biggest cuts any health service has ever faced, ever in the world, is what we face in the British Health Service over the next 4 years. But alongside that, we face an NHS bill, and I'm not going to go through the details of it, but I will give you one fact that might give you an idea of what that NHS bill is about. There are 690 references to competition in the NHS bill. There is one reference to quality. And really that says it all about what that bill is about. It is about opening it up to the market. And really, when we have the economic crisis that we have today, what the Tories want to do is they want to not just take away our real wages, so we haven't had a pay rise for 2 years, and they want to take away our pensions, but they also want to take away everybody's social wage. They want to take away the wage that you don't get in your wage packet, but that you get through the health service, that you get through the schools, that you get through the benefits that you get, and through the state pensions. They want to take all that away from us. And I think what they want to do is they want to open up the whole of those things that we view as services into a market so that they can be bought and sold and turned into commodities. And you can see across the world when that happens, 90% of disease is in sort of, the developing world, but that has less than 10% of the healthcare to deal with it. Most of that disease is preventable and treatable, but it is neither prevented nor treated because capitalism doesn't make money out of doing that. And that's what they want to extend. And that's why I think we have a huge battle facing us over the welfare state in the next, very short time actually, in the next year. I think what's encouraging is precisely what Tony talked about, that we're doing that in an atmosphere where I think people feel more willing and more needing to actually be part of that fight and to do something. And that's why I think for us as socialists, we have to say that the first thing we have to be is we have to be at the heart of every single bit of agitation over the welfare state. It's the NHS's birthday on Tuesday next week, and there will be protests outside probably a third of hospitals in England. We need to find them, we need to go there, we need to build them. Andrew Lansley's coming to Manchester on Thursday next week, and we intend to give him a right Manchester welcome to show him. That Unison has tripled its recruitment ever since Dave Prentice went on television position and said that we were serious about fighting pensions, not just to fight pensions, but to defend the services that we provide, I think reflects the fact that people do want to be part of that, and we ought to be optimistic about wherever we do dip our toe in the water. And I think we need to be a little bit more, let's just have a go and do things, rather than wait for necessarily something to be called. Although interestingly, I think more and more people are calling things over, particularly the health service. You look at the 38-degree petition and various other things that took off from absolutely nowhere. I think the second thing you have to do when you're at work, and in some ways it probably comes first, but I think you have to be political about the way that you talk about it. They try and claim that our health service is not affordable, right? They say that we have more debt than we've ever had before, which isn't even true, but that somehow that we have to pay the price for doing that. And I think we have to be the people who constantly say to people, actually we have enough money to pay for the health service 10 times over. Partly if you remove the market from it so it's much cheaper, but partly if you take the money off the super rich who are evading tax, who are not paying, having their tax collected, and ought to be paying more in the first place anyway. That would clear not just the NHS debt. Opens up to us is it opens us up to us to an argument about being political about wider issues. So when we go on strike or we support strikes about pensions, it isn't just because I don't want to be poor when I'm old, although I certainly don't want to be poor when I'm old, but what sort of healthcare will I provide if I'm 66 or 68? What sort of teaching will a teacher provide if they're 66 or 68 and been doing it for 45 years? We will not be the patient kind, not that I'm very often old, but we will not be people that you necessarily want to be treated by. And I think we have to say the defence of pensions is linked to the defence of services, and everybody has an interest in standing together. We also have to be the people that fight the divisions that they're trying to use to stop us fighting together. Ian Duncan Smith this weekend has said that we should stop employing immigrant workers, migrant workers, foreign workers, and we should employ British people. Over a third of health service workers are people who are migrant workers, not necessarily born or trained in this country. The NHS has been built by black and white people. It has survived on the basis of the black and white people. If we're going to defend the NHS, we have to have black and white people working together, and saying that you shouldn't have a job is not the way to do it. And the other thing is, even if they get rid of all those black people, do you really think that they're going to replace them with white? They'll just say, no, those jobs are gone forever. This isn't about defending and saving our jobs, to use their horrible terminology. It's about making cuts and creating divide and rule, and socialists have to be the people who say that wherever we are. Third thing I want to say that you have to do is solidarity. And one of the things that I think it's easiest to do solidarity over is about the welfare state, and again particularly the health service. If you're nervous, if you don't work in a workplace that's necessarily unionised, if you don't work somewhere where you're particularly confident about what you're doing, you would be hard pressed to find anybody where you work who thinks that the Tories should be doing what they're doing to the health service at the moment. Take a health service petition round. It begins to open up that question of what sort of world do we want to live in, and what sort of world are we being made to live in, and why are so many of us not getting what we want as a result of it. And I think that solidarity, taking petitions, doing collections for strikers, doing sort of, messages of support, taking people down to picket lines, isn't just about supporting the people that are doing those fights. It's also about changing where you work. If people where I work, all sign petitions and collection money for the strikes that happened on the 30th. So even people who didn't come to the picket line, although a number of them did, the ones that didn't wanted to know what it was like, wanted to know how big it was, wanted to know what the response was, and felt like they were a part of it. It makes people feel like it's possible to fight, and they are part of it. And the payoffs in terms of how much people feel more confident to fight, and not just for the people that you send solidarity to, but I think most crucially are the people who send that solidarity and the difference that it makes for you where you work. Lastly, I want to end really with a sense of urgency, Because I think often health workers have said, oh God, they're making cuts, it's terrible and what have you. I actually think when it comes to the healthcare, that we are in danger of moving to the sort of system where when you are ill, you will not get the care you want. We are seeing rationing coming in, so people who've had regular physio for long-term conditions are now being told you get 10 goes and that's it, and are left with the pain and the consequences of that. We are returning to, now Bevan talked about in place of fear, we are going back to where health becomes something that you have to not just be terrified because it's not very nice when you're ill, but actually that you can't get the things that you need to be better. I think there's an urgency, but there also is an absolute commitment of huge layers of people in Britain around the health service and around our welfare state. We need to go out and mobilise that.
Well, I think the contribution made by people from their own experience has been very, very powerful. But when people come to a conclusion because what they see themselves, that really does make a difference in the registers. I want to begin with just one recollection myself, and it was heard me say before, forgive me, but when I was 18, I was on a troop ship going to South Africa where I learned to fly as an RAF pilot. And we had a meeting on war aims. Now, war aims were really what we're talking about. What do we want after the war? We want a better world. And we all gathered there, and one man got up and he made a speech which I've never forgotten. He said, comrades, in the 1930s we had mass unemployment. He said, we don't have unemployment during wartime. He said, if you would have full employment killing Germans, why can't we have full employment building schools, building hospitals, recruiting doctors, recruiting teachers, building homes? And that was how we built the welfare state. And he said you have to apply the same determination to meet the needs of peace as you do to meet the needs of war. He said you'd never hear a general who said, I can't bomb Berlin this month because I haven't seen in my budget. You have to do it. And when I look at this country today, and all the achievements of the NHS and all the threats it faces, there's so many other things now we need to do. I think we need a national care service. So if we are going to live to a greater age, everybody, regardless of income, will be able to have access to the sort of care that old people need. Care with meals, care with transport, care with other things they require. And I think that that would create jobs and would be something that would enormously increase the quality of life for so many people who are around the pride. Now, what else? So many points have been made, remember all of them, but the one thing that sticks in my mind is if you could afford war, you could afford to do what we have to do. There's plenty of money wasted on nuclear weapons, wasted on the war in Afghanistan, the war in Libya, and we've got also to do a peace movement as we are, as well as being a socialist movement. So with those ideas in mind, I wish you all success in the work you do and Marxism conferences and all the achievements that lie ahead. So that will work. Thank you.
Somebody asked, have the Lib Dems become better than New Labour? Well, to be honest, they're not really set on the bar very high, are they? I don't even wonder whether it was a serious question or not. You just think the way they've signed up to the Tory agenda, the way they've allowed stuff go through, there is that pause on the NHS, and I think that pause is nothing really to do with the Lib Dems, but it's to do with people like us and the millions of us who are not prepared to let the NHS be sabotaged. And I think that they responded to that rather than responded, and the Lib Dems responded to that, and they also responded to the fact that they got massacred in the election on the at the beginning of May, and realised that they couldn't carry on just completely following the Tories. But I do think that's an illustration, really, of the vulnerability of this government. This is not Thatcher Thatcher had a majority of 140 and had a mandate to do, sad as it was, to do what she did. This government have not got a mandate to do what they do. They've come in and done things that we never voted for and the people of Britain never voted for. And I think increasingly, although that makes them very vicious, and they are a vicious government, they are not a strong government. And one of the things I loved about the students, somebody asked about the students, was that what the students did is they showed us in workplaces that, you know, that you could do something about it, that you could protest, and that there was a mood for doing that. And I think those students inspired those of us in workplaces. Changed about Britain at the moment is that sense that people do want to do things together. People realise it's not just them and their little bit, but whenever you hear anybody speak, whether it's somebody who works in the private sector, someone who works in a different bit of the public sector, someone who's old, what you realise it's the same issues. And it does come back to the question that the staffer asked about, is this necessary? And I think that we have to say there is a choice in the world that we live in. And you know, back in feudal times, we couldn't cure health, we couldn't house people, we couldn't feed people, we couldn't do any of the basic things that we need in order to survive, and people died in their thousands. Now, we live in a world where technology is such that everybody can eat, everybody can be warm, everybody can have a house, everybody can have a health service when they need it, and 3/4 of the people who are ill don't need to be ill in the first place. The reason we don't have those things is because we work in a world that is driven by profit, and as long as it's driven by profit, we will not have that. And yes, you could argue that maybe we were very lucky in 1945 and we managed to get benevolent governments right across the Western world. And now those benevolent governments have somehow stopped being benevolent. Personally, I think there's a slightly better theory about that, which is partly what Tony talked about. During the Second World War, they effectively did nationalise healthcare because private healthcare was rubbish. They did nationalise coal and steel and all the things they needed to keep a war going. They did build nurseries, they did all sorts of things to get us into work because they needed us to work for the war effort. And people said we are not doing this during a war and then go back to the poverty of the 30s and the fear of the 30s. And in a way the welfare state was, Nyberg called it, in place of fear. We are now coming back to that fear again. We're coming back where they want us to be frightened of everything that we do. And I think people have had enough of that. And they know that if you do nothing, it can only get worse. And therefore people are looking to do something. And I think we have to be careful. The question about students asked about the NUS leadership. And the NUS leadership have behaved disgracefully. But actually the fact that they called some of the demonstrations in the first place did make it easier to get started. In Unison and other unions, there is a beginning of some call. They might not mean it. I don't care whether they mean it or not. I don't care whether they want to go on strike in October. They've told me they do at the moment. And that gives me legitimacy to go back to my branch, to go back to the people that I work with and build something. And I think they've also given legitimacy. You look at on the 30th, it wasn't just the teachers and the civil servants who were out, but there were 4 Unison branches that were out as well. We would never in the past have got permission to go out on strike at the same day and to do solidarity. And they did that because they know that there is a will for us to fight together and that it's difficult for them to resist it. They might not like it, but they're doing it. And there is a bit of a green light and we have to grasp that green light because we will not have that green light forever. The potential is that it will be destroyed. One talks about whether we need sort of pragmatism or not. There are currently, and the lowest estimate is there are 35,000 unnecessary deaths every year in the health service as a result of the market implementations that have been brought in over the last 12 years. 34,000 people die. We in Britain are very lucky. There is more research done on drugs for pets than there are on drugs for illnesses and diseases of the developing world. This system has got its priorities wrong. We are rich, we can afford it, but we don't afford it because we don't make money. People are beginning to say they want an end to that. They want not just to fight to get the old NHS back, because the old NHS can be taken away from us again. We want a society that actually delivers things for everybody, where we decide and make the decisions ourselves about whether pets for drugs should be a priority over pets for Africa, or whether we can afford both and just get rid of the millionaires and the billionaires and the people who are ripping us off altogether.